Until 1974, the vice president typically resided in his own home, conducting business from his offices in the West Wing and the Eisenhower Executive Office Building next door to the West Wing on the White House premises. When providing security for the vice president's homes became cost prohibitive, Congress authorized a sanctioned home for the vice president. Located on the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., No. 1 Observatory Circle was originally built in 1893 for the superintendent of the observatory. In 1923, the chief of naval operations took a liking to the house and moved into it for himself. Each subsequent CNO called the residence home until Congress approved a resolution to renovate the house into the official residence of the vice president in 1974. The renovations were complete that year, but it would be 3 years before a vice president lived in the house full-time. Nixon's resignation saw Gerald Ford ascending to the White House before he could use the vice presidential residence, and Ford's vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, also owned a well-secured residence in Washington, using No. 1 Observatory Circle only for entertaining. Still, the Rockefellers donated millions of dollars in furnishings to the Queen Anne-style house. Every vice president since Walter Mondale, Jimmy Carter's VP, has lived in the house, each successive vice presidential family decorating the house to suit their own tastes. When Al Gore and his family moved in 1993, his family oversaw a complete redecoration of the house, including a new dining room table, new furniture in the library, and renovation of the grounds and veranda to make them more suited to outdoor entertaining. Lieutenant George C. Ashman of the Union Light Guard once had a chance encounter with President Abraham Lincoln at what became known as Lincoln's Summer White House. The nation was embroiled in civil war, and one night the lieutenant happened upon the president on a midnight stroll, while Lincoln was consumed with thought.
I saw a man walking alone and leisurely across the path I was taking, and as I came near him, I saw it was Mr. Lincoln. At an earlier hour, I would have kept from speaking, but prompted by anxiety, I said, "Mr. President, isn't it rather risky to be out here at this hour?" He answered, "Oh, I guess not. I couldn't rest, and I thought I'd take a walk." He was quite a distance outside the line of infantry guards about the house where the family was staying. He turned back after I spoke to him, and I passed on to where the escort was camped.
Even at what was ostensibly the first family's escape from the heat and political pressures of downtown Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln's cottage at the Soldiers' Home in the northeastern section of the district often saw the president ruminating on the various problems that he and the divided country faced. From June through November each year of Lincoln's presidency, the first family called the cottage home. Situated on the third highest elevation point in Washington, near what are now the Petworth and Park View neighborhoods, the cottage also served President Buchanan prior to Lincoln's term in office, and served as the summer White House for subsequent presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester A. Arthur as well. During Lincoln's first summer at the Soldiers' Home, he sketched the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration, the largest and most ambitious of all the New Deal agencies, went to work providing employment for millions of unemployed Americans. At the time, America was suffering from the Great Depression, and President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to use the untapped labor resource to build public buildings and roads. Nearly every community in the United States had a new school, bridge, or park built by the WPA, and in 1938, in Catoctin Mountain Park, near the town of Thurmont, Maryland, an installation known as High Catoctin was opened. The camp was originally designed as a retreat for federal government agents and their families, but 4 years later, President Roosevelt had the property converted into a presidential retreat. officially designated as Naval Support Facility Thurmont, and staffed by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, Roosevelt nicknamed the retreat Shangri-La after the fictional Himalayan paradise, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower later officially renamed the installation after his father and grandson, Camp David. In addition to serving as a vacation home or weekend getaway for the first family, Camp David has also hosted foreign dignitaries, as well as a meeting place for cabinet and other advisors to the president. Roosevelt hosted Sir Winston Churchill in 1943, and Eisenhower held his first cabinet meeting at the compound. The Kennedys enjoyed horseback riding, and later President Gerald Ford would ride his snowmobile around the retreat. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush dedicated Evergreen Chapel, a non-denominational church that holds both Catholic Mass and Protestant services, open to, of course, the first family, as well as the 400 military personnel and their families that serve at Camp David. Both Presidents George W. Bush and President Barack Obama made the Evergreen Chapel their primary place of worship, and Bush's youngest sister, Dorothy Bush Koch, was married in the first wedding ceremony ever held at Camp David in June 1992. Most recently, Camp David has hosted the 2012 G8 Summit, where world leaders from the wealthiest industrialized countries met to discuss mainly the European sovereign debt crisis. On President Harry S. Truman's fifth trip to Key West, Florida, to stay at what became known as Truman's Little White House, Truman had just finished an arduous campaign for re-election, and on November 7, 1948, when he arrived at the Naval Airfield in Boca Chica, Florida, the mayor and other prominent citizens of Key West greeted the president. A large banner congratulated the newly elected Truman. President Truman later thanked the mayor and the town of Key West in a letter dated November 13, 1948.
My dear Mayor Adams, please accept from a grateful heart this assurance of my appreciation of the wonderful welcome accorded to me by yourself and the good people of Key West and community. It warmed my heart and will long be treasured among happy Key West memories. May I also express to you, and through you to the citizens of Key West, my hearty appreciation of such a fine message of congratulations. I read your thoughtful expressions and wanted all of you to know how much they mean to me. Very sincerely, yours, Harry S. Truman.
2 years before this visit, Truman was ordered by his doctor to take a vacation in a warm climate. He had just served 19 months in office without a decent break and was diagnosed with exhaustion. The house in Key West offered the perfect prescription. Upon leaving from his first stay in 1946, Truman vowed to return for every vacation. And return he did, staying for 175 days of his presidency, with advances in telephone technology allowing Truman to conduct presidential business from the Key West vacation home. Truman often traveled with members of his cabinet, chiefs of staff, and foreign officials, and they would regularly fish, hold poker games, and show movies at the house. Not long after Truman's re-election, Division Street in Key West was renamed Truman Avenue in honor of the president. Today, the house is an historic site and museum, but the Little White House is still used by presidents, former presidents, and chiefs of staff. Most recently, former President Bill Clinton and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton spent a weekend at the house in January 2005.
Here's the answer which I will give to President Roosevelt. Put your confidence in us. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle or the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
During the Second World War, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was a frequent visitor to the White House in Washington, D.C., and a guest of the Roosevelts. Typically, the president's guests stayed one night in the White House, with the rest of the stay to follow in a hotel or embassy. Churchill's ubiquitous presence, however, illustrated the need for an official guest house of the president. Winston Churchill found Roosevelt a stimulating conversationalist and soon called the man a great friend.
Meeting Roosevelt was like uncorking your first bottle of champagne.
One story has it that Churchill, having spent the day and most of the night engaged with Roosevelt in conversation, made his way towards the Roosevelt's family quarters at nearly 3 in the morning. The president was asleep by that time, but Churchill wished to wake President Roosevelt for further discussion. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt encountered Churchill before he could make his way to Franklin, and vehemently persuaded the Prime Minister to wait until breakfast. Not long after this incident, the president approved the purchase of the Blair House for use as the official guest house of the president. The house was originally owned by Dr. Joseph Lovell, first Surgeon General of the United States Army, and was later named for the editor of the Washington Globe and Congressional Globe, the first published record of congressional proceedings, Francis Preston Blair. Blair became a trusted advisor to Presidents Jackson, Lincoln, and Van Buren, and in 1859 he built a home next door to the Blair House for his daughter Elizabeth and her husband, Admiral Samuel Phillips Lee. The Lee House later became a part of the Blair House complex. The purchase by Roosevelt in 1942 included all the china and furnishings in the house, and the Lee House was added to the complex as additional space for foreign dignitaries. In addition to night owl guests like Churchill keeping the president awake, Washington, D.C. hotels were constantly overbooked, and more rooms were needed as World War II continued. After the war, and during the presidency of Harry Truman, it became clear that the White House was in serious need of restoration. Chandeliers swayed and floors wobbled dangerously. By summer of 1948, the living quarters and state dining room had been fitted with emergency supports, but the writing was on the crumbling wall. The house would need to be completely gutted and rebuilt. During the restoration, Truman and the First Family moved into the Blair House. Truman conducted business as usual in the west and east wings of the White House, as those sections remained open during the reconstruction of the main White House. The president commuted each day to the offices. Like his little White House in Key West, Truman began to understand that the White House was simply wherever the president happened to be. Now, especially with improved communication technologies.
It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
While living in the Blair House, Truman developed what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine, the policy of communist containment for which Truman asked Congress in 1947 for $400 million for military and economic aid for countries like Greece and Turkey, which were faced with conquest by communist insurrection. Truman also signed the European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan, the following year, which was designed to help rebuild European nations wrecked after World War II. An attempt on Truman's life was made while he lived at the Blair House. On November 1st, 1950, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, two Puerto Rican nationalists, attempted to assassinate the president. Their goal was to bring attention to the independence movement in their home country. They tried to shoot their way into the main entrance of the Blair House, but White House police officers and Secret Service agents returned fire, killing Torresola and wounding Collazo. Truman was awakened by the gunfire and rushed to a window to observe, but was told by a guard to take cover. Today, the Blair House continues to serve guests of the president.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.